Okay, welcome to a joint hearing on Wednesday, January 22nd, 2025 of the Senate and House Education Committees. This is really an opportunity for us to learn more about the educational quality standards that we have in the state. We got a bit of a preview today from the State Board of Education, but this is really, I think, more of an opportunity to learn what does it mean in the field. To have these standards, how are they, you use the word enforced, but how are they dealt with, and sort of any interplay between the field and the agency of education on these. So we've got two guests who will introduce themselves and a presentation, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's our pleasure. Thank you for having us. I like the elbow room. New digs.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Temporary.
Oh, it's temporary.
We're moving into a sweet new space.
Okay. Well, thank you. My name is Mike McRae. I work as the Associate Executive Director for the Vermont Principals Association. I'm a former teacher, school counselor, middle school principal, and high school principal. I'm in my 6th year at the association. My job is wide-ranging. Sometimes I take out the garbage and that kind of thing at the association. And I also have the privilege of working with our members on a regular basis. So I figure that on average, I talk to between 75 or 100 school leaders a week. So I do my best to relay that information to anyone that might find it useful, including you folks. And I work on providing the professional learning for the association, for both its members and its communities if the need arises. And we also have the responsibility and the opportunity to hold the rules for sports. A lot of times when you hear VPA, that's what people think of first. There's around 50 committees. We are very dependent upon our athletic directors, all of the volunteers that go along with academic athletics, the officials. We're very indebted, and it's really a network that's weaved together and relies on all kinds of people, so shout out to those folks. And then we do our best to provide advocacy and voice for our membership as well here. So that's me, that's my role, and happy to be here with Andrew.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you again for the invitation. My name is Dr. Andrew Jones. I currently serve as the Assistant Superintendent for Mount Mansfield School District, but I have over 15 years of experience in Vermont Public Schools. I've also served as a Director of Curriculum, and prior to that, I was a high school science teacher. I also teach courses at the University of Vermont in various areas such as education policy and supervision evaluation, curriculum management, and other areas. So that's me in a nutshell.
Great. And so I guess where I would like to start is to learn a little bit about what you've already heard today. And I know that there are some folks with lots of experience both in schools, Kate, Representative McCann, and Aaron, and maybe many others, and others that are new to the committee and maybe don't have as much history. So I would love to just sort of get a level setting from you folks, and so that we're not repeating things, hear about what your primary questions are, and then we can speak to that. We do have a presentation with all kinds of slides. We'll never get through all of them, but there's more there if you want to dig into them. But if you wouldn't mind, if somebody would just give us an idea of what you've already heard.
Well, so we've got two committees here, so I can't speak for the Senate Education Committee.
I'm glad I asked. Yeah.
But the 2025 version of the House Education Committee has only had a fairly brief presentation this morning from the State Board of Education about education quality standards from their point of view.
Great.
Not a whole lot about the agency's implementation of them, nor about how it actually translates to the field. So I wouldn't worry about being repetitive.
Okay.
So
Great.
We had the same presentation yesterday, so we're exactly the same position.
Great. So we have Senate Ed with us and House Ed. Are there other committees represented?
That's us.
Okay. Great. And it's Annie, right? Thank you for your help in getting us set up. And did you all get the materials?
Yes.
Are you already looking at them?
I wouldn't say we've looked at it, but I say we
Okay.
have them.
You have them in front of you if
Yes,
you need
we do,
them?
yes.
Okay, then I'm not gonna worry too much about projecting up here. I also have them here, but if anybody wants to see them, I think they're available as an
They're right on our
attachment.
website.
Great.
Your name. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, I guess for me, I think it sometimes is helpful to think back, to look in a historical context. That provides grounding for me anyways. And to go all the way back, Dewey is often invoked, right? And all over this country, and we have that namesake here in Vermont. And in 1916, he was talking about the importance of education to democracy. His quote is there. I won't read it to you because you've probably heard it and you can read it for yourselves. But I like to start there when we think about what will students learn in Vermont. And for me, the education quality standards answers that question. It answers, what is our top document? What is our vision? Andrew mentioned that word just in the hallway. Now, what is our vision for schools? What is our vision for students? And I just view it as that top document. So for a historical context, I start with Dewey. And then, it's not the first time Vermont has been down the road of trying to answer this question, what will students learn, right? What will be the content? What will be the curriculum? In 1969, there was an emphasis on student-centered learning, right? Vermont, ahead of its time, focused on student-centered learning. That was the Vermont Design for Education. So folks made that decision then. And then in the 70s, it was the basic competencies of Vermont. And yes, I hear a murmur in the room. Please, let's surface that. What comes to mind for you when you hear about the basic competencies in Vermont?
Staying after school to take our basic competency test.
Which included what?
That was fairly basic, I think, math, language arts. Maybe that was about it.
Yep. Depending on the grade level, it was very specific things, like being able to make change from a $10 bill, right? And so there was minutia in those competencies, right? And so that was in the 1970s. I'm not sure I would call it a groan, but there might have been a groan there. And then in 2000, we moved up to the framework of standards and learning opportunities. These vital results. So folks that were teachers or in education through that time, I see lots of nodding in the room. You remember that as well. And just as a quick footnote to this walk through history, this was prepared by my friend and colleague, Mike Martin, many years ago, and I've just used it as a touch point throughout the years. And Mike is a longtime teacher, curriculum director, and is the executive director for the Roland Foundation now. In 2010, that was when the Common Core was launched, and the Common Core, for those of you who are not in education, is a national framework. It is not officially from the federal government, but is adopted by all of the states, 49 maybe. Kate, you look like maybe you know. Okay, nearly all the states, I'm gonna say that confidently, to say these are our standards in math. These are our standards in ELA, English Language Arts. And I think maybe what is important to note is when people talk about the standards, this is what students will learn in math and English, that some folks have estimated that if you did all of them that are in the Common Core, you might be in school until you're like 30. So it's quite extensive, and there's a lot of material. So a lot of times we talk about grouping standards or prioritizing standards, which happens at a state and local level. Moving us more to the points of the education quality the EQS, Education Quality Standards document. I came on the scene, I now have enough gray hair on the top of my head and in my beard to remember this. We updated the education quality standards in Vermont in 2013, and they went into effect in 2014. That was paired with Act 77. And for those of you who don't have your jargon handy, that's the Flexible Pathways Law. which was really meant to, and this is my phrasing, sort of crack open secondary school learning to have access to this wild thing called online learning. I know, right? It was novel at the time. And make sure that everybody has access to career and technical ed, make sure that we have access to dual enrollment, and also early college as part of flexible pathways of what was implemented in 2014. And from there, we have been exploring that document, working on it. There was some implementation, broad scale implementation efforts at the time. They were relatively short-lived. And I think that's important to note that it was a major overhaul of the EQS in 2014 and didn't come with widespread universal implementation. And much like many of our efforts, it's localized and has been implemented at different varying levels depending on different local situations. So that was 2014, and suddenly that's a decade ago, more than a decade ago. It feels like yesterday that we were starting that work. A lot was important, well, to me, was particularly important for 2014 is that we added transferable skills. Things that people sort of universally agree about, like communication is important, problem solving is important, critical thinking is important. Those kinds of life skills that our entrepreneurs and our business leaders often say are the most lacking and that we most need to build into our school system and our learning standards. Those were added in 2014. And that's when we made a shift to when you started hearing people talking about proficiency-based learning. I think it's important to just take a little bit of time here to say, in some states, people say competency-based learning. Other states, people say standards-based learning. And in other states still, including Vermont, we say proficiency-based learning. But essentially, for me, means that we have agreed that there are standards in which that we are going to teach towards and from, right? And that without those standards, we would just be like, I don't know, what should we do in fourth grade? What do you think? But no, there's adopted standards that we're going to utilize, and those are our proficiencies. Sometimes people call them, other places they call them competencies. I use those words fairly interchangeably, but there was a lot of energy and a lot of dialogue around the word proficiency in 2014. In 2019, the Act 1 was universally passed, a bill for ethnic and social equity standards, and that led to the revision of the 2014 version of the EQS that is now ready for implementation for 2025. So essentially, a decade later, there was another round of revisions. Those revisions were taken under consideration by many, many people. One thing that I think the Act 1 working group did a particularly good job in their recommendations to the state board for this newest revision was to incorporate all kinds of voice, particularly underrepresented voices, which was part of the point, or maybe the point of Act 1, and really invited readers from a very wide spectrum to provide feedback. And I was lucky enough to be on that Act 1 working group, lots of revisions, lots of long hours to bring a draft to the state board for their consideration. They took that under consideration, made their own edits, took in more feedback, and went through the L card, the technical part of adopting those rules to become the law of the land. And now that document is updated and ready for educators to begin using anew with a refreshed education quality standards document for 2025. That's the arc of the history. I went all the way back to 1916, so I probably lost some of you. Any questions about that context?
I don't know if this is premature to ask, so feel free to bump this later. I really appreciate the kind of historical context. I heard you say that the education quality standards are kind of our vision, or sort of our aspirational benchmark of where we want to be in schools. We heard last session again and again and again from the field, we lack a vision for public education in the state. We made it part of the charge of the Commission on the Future of Public Education. The current secretary has been very vocal about that and has embarked on a list and learned towards it. There's been all this discussion of vision. And so this is maybe a better question for the end, but do we have the vision and we just need to use it or implement it differently? Or are we really lacking a vision?
That's a great question. I really appreciate it. I think it provides us a great start. It is meant, in my view, to be the top document from which things would flow. And I think that there is a fair bit of excitement from educators about this revised version. I think there is warranted trepidation about more work. I mean, people are already very tired and feeling overwhelmed. I think that there is a natural distaste for unfunded mandates, natural distaste for what feels like could be another thing. And I've had the opportunity to be one of the people working with educators. I was in a district that not long ago that invited me down to talk during a district in-service day. What's this EQS all about? And initially there was reservations in the room. It was teachers, it was paraeducators. And as I started to help them unpack it, they started to recognize, oh, this is already our work. We have a lot to build on and more room to grow, of course, lots of things that can be goals of ours. But I think that the initial trepidation about yet another thing calmed down a fair bit and more like, okay, this is reflective of what we are doing and what we want to aspire towards. So, I mean, I haven't talked to, all 13,000 educators in the state, but I have been in several rooms where they are learning about this, and that's been sort of the way in which those conversations have trended. And I will turn to Andrew for some excitement, maybe.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to build off of that, I think that, I would say the EQS does provide a really solid vision for many aspects of our education system. I don't know if it encompasses every single aspect, but from someone who, was formerly an educator in the classroom and was in the classroom when the 2014 version came out, and now a district administrator with these new versions coming out, I would say that, we're not starting from scratch. This isn't something like completely brand new. Many of the things in the educational quality standards, the newest version, are already in place. That being said, there's still kind of a pretty big gap between where many schools are at and seeing that vision to fruition. And so I think we already have a pretty solid foundation from the 2014 version of the EQS. And I can say when I was in the classroom, I used that as an educator. Not all educators did, and now not all educators are necessarily aware of it. So I think that's part of the work, is helping folks to become familiar with it. That's something we're doing in our district right now, is just getting the document out there, making sure that people are familiar with it, reading it, so that, as Mike was saying, we can relieve some of that trepidation and concern that this is like some new big thing we have to do, when in actuality, many of these things are already in place to some degree. With the 2014 EQS, again, I was implementing many of those aspects in my own classroom, and I found it really exciting because it provided me something to focus on to help improve. And as someone who's still in the field, I'm very excited about these newly revised ones, because it's taken a lot of the great parts of the 2014 version and made some pretty necessary improvements in there, so that ultimately we can ensure that we provide equitable, inclusive learning experiences for all students, particularly those who have been historically marginalized. And with the Act 1 working group, who really took the lead to kind of make some of those revisions, I think they did a really good job to incorporate those pieces in there. So for me, I see this as an exciting opportunity to help kind of transform our schools. There's a lot in there. So I think that's important to understand, is there's many pieces. Some impact leaders, some impact educators. For me, one of the most important pieces is section 2120.1, instructional strategies. And those are really, some are things that might happen at a more school or district level, but others, and most of them, are things that are going to happen where the rubber hits the road, in the classroom, with teachers. And so for me, that's really where I focus my attention. And so we have that in the presentation, and there's a nice visual. One of our colleagues, Emily Gilmore, put this together from Great Schools Partnership that color codes sections of the instructional strategies and then ties them to kind of larger grain size strategies and frameworks and pieces like that, such as proficiency-based learning, as we were just discussing, universal design for learning, which again is not new, among others. Culturally responsive and sustaining education, which I think is another kind of big element to this. And so there's a lot of great stuff in here, but a major takeaway is there's a lot. And as Mike already mentioned, there's a lot of educators. It certainly varies from district to district and school to school, but folks are still a little weary after the COVID pandemic. And there's been kind of some new changes for a lot of schools, certainly an increased need around social emotional learning. And there's other things that schools are trying to get back to. So Act 173 from 2018, which incorporates what's called Tiered System of Supports, or MTSS. So much work that was kind of in process fell by the wayside during COVID, and it was just focused on managing that. And I would say just in the last maybe 2 years, we've really been able to get back to business as usual as best we can. And one of those pieces is getting back to implementing MTSS and making sure that that structure and those processes are well implemented. Act 139 from last year, though not necessarily a huge lift for a lot of schools, it's still something that we're ensuring that we're meeting all compliance on, and really just making sure that we're doing a good job for elementary school with literacy. There's Act 77 that we discussed, so PLPs, middle school and high schools, are getting back to that routine. And then, not something we're going to talk a ton about today, but there's also the IRIS Ethnic Studies framework, which it really pairs or complements with the EQS. And though not necessarily required, a lot of schools are trying to put that into practice at the same time as the EQS. So it's not just the EQS. As someone who was in the classroom, putting proficiency-based learning and other pieces into practice, this work takes time, because as a teacher, you've got your class in front of you, and so it's not just focused on, all right, I'm going to make these changes. You also have to teach the kids that are in front of you, and so you're trying to do these things at the same time. And what I think is important is that this doesn't just happen in 1 or 2 years. This takes really several years to happen. Because you need time for folks to, like I was saying, just be familiar with the document, understand what needs to happen, and then to actually build capacity to put it into practice, and then to try those things out. When I was implementing proficiency-based learning in the classroom, I started incorporating what are called formative assessments, which are essentially a really small grain size assessment that does not impact a student's overall grade in their class. It's really like a dipstick to kind of understand, but that really went against how students were familiar with school. And so that took a while for me to kind of sort out and make it work within my classroom. So just trying something, it doesn't mean it's going to work right off the bat. It takes some time to play around with these things and try to make it work in your own context. Because what works in, say, a science classroom may not necessarily work in an ELA classroom, so you have to make those things fit in there. So overall, again, it's just going to take some time to do. And then I think the other big piece is some of these practices are familiar to principals, district administrators, and teachers. Some are going to be new for them. And for some folks, it may mean changing practices. It also may mean getting rid of some practices that they've done before, which is very difficult to do, especially for someone who's been teaching for a while. Therefore, we need to make sure, and let's see, there's a particular phrase in here that I think is really important to draw out. Educators shall be supported in. That's from the instructional strategies piece. And for me, that's what I really have at the forefront of my mind is it's not something that we're requiring teachers to do, but as someone who is overseeing multiple schools, my focus is on how am I going to support our educators to do this well so that they can support our students and provide this high quality education that we're striving for. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that we provide teachers with time and resources to make sense and understand this, and also to have support to put these things into practice. I'm fortunate in our district that we have what are called instructional coaches, which are individuals who don't have a teaching load. They can just be free to work with other teachers and sit with them to provide job-embedded, ongoing professional learning. And that's also another important term is, doing just like a one-off workshop or something like that could help. It really has to be something that is happening in the day-to-day for teachers to incorporate into their own classroom, being supported by someone else. And then another, I think, important piece to consider is there's a lot of pieces that that I work on. One of those is continuous improvement plans, which is, I think, an important tool to help incorporate in a lot of this work and to have particular goals that we're focused on. Something that some places may already be doing but isn't necessarily explicitly part of the process is to kind of tie the EQS together with the continuous improvement plan. Because one of the things that I wonder about is we have this, in my opinion, a great document that provides a really quality vision for what we want to see in schools and particularly in the classroom. And one of my jobs is to support that implementation. But if we can find avenues to embed elements of the EQS, particularly those instructional strategies, I think that could go a long ways to helping actually move this work forward. Because what concerns me is what I saw happen with the 2014 version of it is we put it out there and we hope that districts can do it. And many districts have the resources and capacity to do it. Not all of them necessarily do. And so that's my main concern is it really comes down to just one word, is implementation. So we have the document, it's out there. Some folks are working on it. I can say that in our district, we are actively working on it. I'm working with our principals and other administrators, and we're starting to pull this down to teachers so that they can start to unpack and understand what this means in their classroom. But without sustained focus on this work, it can go by the wayside. And certainly COVID threw a wrench into all sorts of things. And so I don't know where we'd be today with the EQS, the 2014 version, if that had not happened. But I can say in 2019, before all that went down, we still had a little ways to go with some aspects of the EQS. I'm really hopeful. I think it's an amazing document. I'm excited for it. I just want to make sure that everyone understands the realities of putting this into practice, that it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of support for teachers, and that, as Mike was saying, given just kind of the nature of local control in the state, we need to expect that it's not going to look exactly the same everywhere, that there's probably would be some variability. That's probably fine. But if we want to see this through the end, we need to keep our eyes on this.
Questions?
Anything else from you? Just
I can keep going. People listening to me? I mean, here we go.
We'll do questions for
Yeah, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Representative Burbidge.
So there are some sections of the EQS that there are communities that are not going to like. They're going to actually push back heavily against. And I keep hearing you say that it's a long slog of pushing to implement it. It doesn't sit right with our local communities supposed to have the say over what their community learns, doesn't learn. There's obviously the core, but some of this is not going to fly well. How do you solve for that when your purpose is to make or implore all the communities to learn this way, learn all of these things, but some of them may not agree with specifically Iris or parts of
Ah.
Iris.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Can I go?
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Great question. Often one of the first questions. Just for level setting, Iris is in a subcommittee at the state board right now. So that's where that is.
What is Iris?
Iris is the teaching framework and standards that are part of the updated version. So there's reference to ethnic studies standards in the new EQS. And so that document is
Okay. Just
meant
the
to
Act-
be
this is-
attached to it,
This
yes.
is the Act 1 portion of this.
Standards portion.
The standards
Yeah.
portion of that.
Thank you. Good question and important to get clear. So right now, this part of it is ready to go and ready to be implemented and has passed all the processes. And Iris, its companion document, has not. And it is currently in a subcommittee with the state board. To go to your question, I think that one of the things I've really emphasized in working with people who have asked me about it, educators and that kind of thing, is to think about your strengths, to think about the assets that are in your community. And I'm proud to say that all Vermont communities have assets, right? They have things that are going well, things that they can build on. And you can find things in the EQS that you can build on. There might be other things that are not the right fit for a growth edge at that time, are not the right fit for a goal in that community based on any number of circumstances, right? And there is not an expectation, at least in my mind, that all of these things are going to happen on July 1, 2025 in every district. Each district is going to have the opportunity to do a crosswalk or analysis and say, and I'm encouraging them, what are your assets? Do an assets map, a strength. Hey, this looks like our UDL work, our universal design work. We've been doing this. Let's make a goal here and let's move this ball forward on this part of it. And this piece, we're gonna need to have some community outreach before we set a goal in this area, right? Or we wanna, build up the background knowledge with our faculty on a different element as a primary goal for this aspect of the EQS. And so I think what's important is that we all, as individuals, as systems, as a state, find our growth edge, right? Because if we do something really safe, we're not growing. And if we do something that is too far, that's not gonna happen either. And so, in teacher talk, we talk about ZDP, Zone of Proximal Development, ZPD. And that's that growth edge. And that's been my answer to that question is, find a growth edge. I don't want people to play it super safe, but I also don't want them to set a goal that is so far for the community that they're not gonna be able to understand one another, or you're gonna lose trust. Right?
Because maybe like with that particular document, Iris, you can see some things that are, easily palatable for some people, and then there's some things that are a bridge too far.
Mm-hmm.
And for others, and it's trying to reconcile that one. It sounds like the push is to make sure everybody does it at some point. Whereas, there are those in the community or communities, and full communities in general, who will not support it. So it's trying to, for me, it's trying to get my head around, like, it doesn't sound like it's a requirement. It's a goal of that, the EQS to get there, but it's not a requirement for the community to actually adopt it.
I think it's a great question. What is required versus what is a goal? And I think part of that discussion should continue in that subcommittee, right? If we're talking about Iris, we talk about Iris there. Because it's not enacted yet. And I think I think you had asked about enforcement or oversight, maybe. Accountability, right? And that to me opens a whole nother part of our conversation. And I think that there is an expectation that schools will, and communities and districts will find a growth edge, set a goal, and move towards it. Is it all of them all at once? I don't think so.
I would just maybe perhaps cut a little bit more to the chase than
Yeah.
that and say, I mean, these are the standard, this was a law that was passed, and these are standards that are being developed, and I would say that they are required reading and sort of required strategy, it's requiring you to get to that goal. So I would not call them optional.
Thanks. Other questions?
The continuous improvement, continuous improvement plans and process, from your perspectives of working pretty closely with the field, I've seen big, diagram or charts from the district where I live, from the district where I teach, but what does that actually look like in terms of accountability or support to grow? Like, what happens with those currently?
Yeah.
And what is maybe the potential for?
Oh,
Using them.
I am very much in it.
I might ask you to broaden the answer.
Explain what they are.
Well,
Yeah.
that was over there, but really, talk a little bit from, so we have EQS come into play in 2014. How has accountability worked?
Oh.
I would assume continuous improvement plans being one thing, field reviews being another.
Yep.
But has it been effective?
Mhm.
What's the plan going forward?
Yeah, I can speak to both of those for sure. So, from the accountability, perspective, first off, the integrated field reviews, which, as I understand, we haven't done those since COVID. I was part of those back when I was at, I think it was when I was at Mill River as their director of curriculum. So we had some integrated field reviews, and then I also went out to, it was Springfield High School where I did one. Those are, I found, a useful tool to really have practitioners being out in schools, providing feedback back to practitioners. It was, accountability isn't the term that comes to mind. I see it as more feedback. But I'll say that for better or for worse, there, at least from my position, isn't a whole lot of firm accountability in a lot of different ways, particularly as we think about the educational quality standards. There's no EQS police per se that's coming through to see are you doing this exactly how you're supposed to be doing it? Because proficiency-based learning, for instance, and the proficiency-based graduation requirement component looks vastly different from one school to another, which again, pros and cons to that. You want to make sure that it fits the context of the school, because every school and every district is a little bit different, and so you don't want a prescription. But at the same time, no one is necessarily scrutinizing everything to, down to the small grain size. Now, the continuous improvement plans, which are part of federal statute, right now isn't necessarily clear connections with EQS. This year, they've completely revamped the CIP process. So in the past, that would be the AOE. Thank you. The Agency of Education.
Yep.
Because of my understanding, some changes from the federal government. And so in the past, at least in the last few years, the way that the continuous improvement plan worked, and also note, this looked vastly different during COVID. I'm not even going to go into that, but there's a whole other system. But the way it worked, it was at the local education agency level, so the district level, where you would get a group of stakeholders together, so usually educators, administrators, maybe parents, board members, ultimately trying to gather input on what do we need to focus on. And then, at least most recently, you had to have two goals. So one was an academic-related goal, and one was a safe and healthy schools goal. So for an example, in our district, our academic goal was related around literacy, and our safe and healthy schools goal was connected with social-emotional learning, particularly student belonging. It could look vastly different. There's a lot of wiggle room there, but you have to have two goals, and they have to be under those two major umbrellas. And then related to that is you have to do what's called a data inventory, where you look at a wide swath of data, academic data, social emotional learning sorts of data from, I don't know if you're familiar with the YRBS, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, so pulling in that data as well. But essentially what you need to do is you have to look at what your needs are and identify what the needs are, identify goals, and then because schools get a variety of funding in Title I and Title II and other money, is you need to say, we're going to use our money for Title I and Title II for these things because our data shows that these are our areas of need. So for us, in our school district, our Title I money goes to pay for literacy interventionists because our data shows that we need additional support in literacy. And we also use our Title II funds to pay for instructional coaches to support that work as well. So it has to be all kind of backed up. This year, the major change is it's dropping down from the district level down to the school level, which I think makes a lot of sense because in my district, if you're familiar with Mount Mansfield, it's a very big district. And even though we're in the same district, the needs of one school are going to look a little different from another school. And so this year, that work will be done at the school level. So same thing, a little bit different, but school-based data, school-based information, as opposed to the LEA. That is, I think, a mechanism because it is connected with Title I, to make sure that those funds are being used properly. That's the big accountability piece of it, but not necessarily with the EQS. And what I was suggesting in my testimony is, and the CIP process is just one avenue, but the more we can craft coherence with the different elements, between the Agency of Education, State Board of Education, et cetera, it just makes schools less kind of, bureaucratic and can streamline so we can actually focus on it. The last thing I'll say is I appreciate the CIP process because it does provide a mechanism to identify in a collaborative fashion large goals for the district and schools to really focus attention on and to make sure that we're using those funds in ways that are needs-based.
Chair Conlon, you mentioned two parts there. You said the continuous improvement plan, which is really a direct relationship with the Agency of Education and is an element of oversight, no question.
Yes.
And the second thing you said was the field review. And to my knowledge, tell me if I'm wrong, anyone, that has not happened since the pandemic. And the field review was essentially other school leaders and other school folks going to the site of their colleagues, having a rubric that was major buckets of goals for our state, talking about vision, that kind of thing, and saying, we love what you're doing in the classroom on this, we see an opportunity for you to grow in this area. And I think generally speaking was fairly well received because you do so much learning when you're on the tour. And of course you get that feedback from your colleagues when you've had them in your school for a few days. So that is not currently happening. And it's one of my recommendations, or our recommendations from slide 28. It's the last slide. You'll see it there. It's field review, rubrics, and language. So if that is going to go back into place, I don't know if it is or not, if it is, it should have this updated language to go along with it. And related, I feel like one big important element that we've left out of the conversation so far, and I see it's already 2:46, so, is the state board in their adoption of the updated EQS. Sometimes you hear it referred to as Rule 2000 series, right? So it's the Rule 2000 series. That's the same thing. They also did the work, and they were busy, of updating the corresponding independent school language, which is referred to as Rule 2200. And so both of those documents got an update with this lens. They are not the same. We have two different sets of rules, one for the public schools and one for the independent schools. And I think the VPA's position has been fairly clear that we feel like if there is public money, that they should have the same rules. And there's some areas that we could get into. But that did happen, that the state board also updated those. And I heard recently that there's quite a backlog for accountability or checking on our independent schools from the agency as well.
Just looking at your last page here, recommendations going forward, I mean, the basic theme, it seems to me, with these is within all of those topic areas you brought up, kind of the idea is we've got this great document, EQS. Let's make that sort of the foundation for everything else, or make sure it all ties together.
Exactly, yeah.
Right, and so another example of that would be licensing requirements, right? And there's a committee, people are working on it, but each time, you know, if you have a top document that's been updated, all the parts that it touches also need to be updated. And so those are a few of our suggestions, talking about field review, licensing recommendations, continuous improvement plans, maybe even dedicated professional learning or reorganizing the way in which some of our investments are made at the agency in order to support it, that kind of thing.
Going back and kind of looking at the history here, I was in the basic competencies. So something like the Common Core is still a thing, right?
Yes.
Yes.
And it is still part of our EQS, and
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you for
we
asking.
don't necessarily throw out the old.
No.
Yes, thank you for asking, and I would point you to slide, it has highlights in it.
Go down.
It is slide 23. And that primary question around what will students learn, and I think we should add to this slide just for future audiences and just list the adopted standards that go within those subject areas. So the first one is ELA, English Language Arts, and then, you know, what we've adopted as a state is Common Core. And so that remains the case, and each of these has an adopted standards framework, right? And we could add those. Why we highlighted the green and yellow is because those are the last two areas that have been added in the last 10 years. And transferable skills, the state made a suggestion, like you can adopt these transferable skills as your standards, but there's been a pretty wide variation in implementation and interpretation around transferable skills. And we're sort of queuing up, in my opinion, to do the same with the ethnic and social equity studies standards without a clearer decision about what those standards are. And to your point, that's where the IRIS discussion comes in.
Yes,
Thank
Senator.
you, Chair. As educators, basic competencies, because you were saying, hey, have it get changed back from a $10 bill, and we have students nowadays that don't have a clue.
Well, I got a story for you.
Yeah. As educators, that you explained that every school has their own programs and that. Should there be, 2 or 3 basic competencies that every school says, hey, a student before they graduate must be able to read this text.
Yeah.
And do matter, because some excel, some struggle, I used to, and still do. But should there be, in your mind as educators, something that basic?
Well, I want to give you a chance to answer that.
I mean, I would say that to some degree, many schools do have that through their proficiency-based graduation requirements, where and again, it varies from school to school, but the districts that I've worked in, we build them from, it's a K-12 view. So even though there's something that will be worked on and assessed 9 through 12, we make sure that their elementary and middle school experience is also going to be preparing them for that. I think there is a lot of commonality between at least high schools with their PBGR piece, where again it connects back to the work that we did with the 2014 version of the EQS to really identify what is it that we expect students to leave our schools being proficient in, and the portrait of a graduate is another component of that, where each school essentially says, this is what you have to do if you're going to graduate. You have to meet these proficiencies. It does look a little bit different from place to place. However, because these larger buckets of ELA, math, science, etc., are connected with national frameworks such as the Common Core or the Next Generation Science Standards or the C3 Global Citizenship Standards, there's a thread of commonality between all those. So a certain, bar, if you will, of what everyone is kind of kind of doing. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
What if that, but should it come down that each school has their own thing? But my question still is, you know, it isn't happening. The proofs and yes, K through 12 matters, but the end product is what really matters. And when you have children coming out, young adults coming out that can't read, can hardly do that, it's, one, it's a letdown from the school, and two, it could be the child as well, and is having this difficulty. That leads me back to that question, should there be a standard that the state says, doesn't matter how, you know, what your end product, when this teacher, when we sit down and you have to read 3 paragraphs to make sure you understand, that you understand how to read, basically, that your literacy is where it should be.
And I'll pass it over to Mike, but I'll just say that just brings up the issue of local control.
Excuse me. Thank you for the question. The story that came to mind for me was that some of my favorite days in my role at the VPA is when I take tickets. Maybe I've been at the door for some of you at the gate. I know I was. I remember Aaron and I had a Colchester was in the championship. And so I get to see thousands of people sometimes on those days, right? Just scanning people's tickets in. And I have had the instance many times with preteens and teens. I'll say, you know, it's $5. And they'll say, I only have a 20, right? Because they think that I can't make change. And we could be, I mean, part of me is like, well, man, I wish they would have picked that up somewhere. In my opinion, I'm sure that they had that somewhere along their curriculum, but they have not practiced it. And the reason they haven't practiced it is because they pay digitally, because things are changing and evolving, right? And so what those things would be the challenge in the conversation. And we might be able to agree as a state to say like, but for sure these things, right? And I'm sure some folks would take up that conversation. What's also interesting to me is depending on which subject area you're in, they're much more specific than others. The next gen science standards, you're gonna find the word mitochondria, right? You're not gonna find that level of minutia or specifics in the English language, or really even the math. Math talks about establishing fluency, and when I think about that, I think about my 9-year-old and my, like, no, you have to know your math facts. I need you to be able to just know, you know, these multiplication tables, because it's gonna make it more accessible for you to be able to manipulate the higher order thinking and access that. So there is this dialogue, at least in math, and I'm looking at a math teacher here, around accessing or establishing fluency so that you can work in higher order skills. There's also the risk, would be the other part of that conversation, at least for me, of getting down into really specific things that are not in higher order thinking or not in Bloom's taxonomy, right, of more agency in your thinking and in your ability to manipulate language. But your question is, but aren't there some things that everybody should be able to have and know? And I think it's a great question. I hope that that's the case in these standards, that would take place. How to measure whether or not, and how to decide which of those things we are gonna elevate would be a different discussion, I think.
Thank you. I think we'll close there. Just
Thank
give
you.
everybody a chance to stretch because we have a very big afternoon.
Yes, we do.